I'm Matt Parker with Forbes Breaking News. At a House Committee on the Rules meeting, Representative Jamie Raskin questioned Representative Cathy McMorris Rodgers about a bill to prevent price gouging at the pump. The Washington Republican expressed, quote, grave concerns with the legislation, which could give additional powers to the president. The Maryland Democrat said that it could help with prices and dismissed any claims that the bill was socialist. Listen to their exchange here.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, when politicians talk about economics, it always cracks me up because, and we've seen a good example of it today. You know, here we have a situation where under the Biden administration, 8.5 or 9 million jobs have been added to the economy. We've had a dramatic reduction in unemployment. We've got the greatest employment figures we've seen in more than 50 years. And our colleagues say, and maybe they're right about it, well, that's just the natural workings of the market. That's supply and demand. And you can't attribute that to any of the policies that the Biden administration has been engaged in to try to promote full employment in the country. And the GDP has gone up, trade has gone up, but they say it's got nothing to do with the Biden administration. That's just the working of the free market. But then, when it comes to inflation, we have a situation where, with COVID-19, we saw the demand for oil and gas plummet because nobody was going anywhere, right? The whole economy was shutting down, so the demand went way down, and the production of oil and gas went way down with it. So then we start to come out of COVID. We start lifting, the various restrictions and mandates. People are using vaccine. Demand now starts soaring, but production hasn't caught up. And we blame it on Joe Biden. That's got to be Joe Biden. It's Biden's fault. It's the Biden administration's fault. But wait a second. I thought we were saying before that when things happen in the economy, those are just the natural laws of supply and demand, and you can develop explanations based on historical events. So this is why it kind of cracks me up to hear politicians talk about economics, because they will demonize and vilify their opponents for anything bad that happens during their administration, but they won't attribute anything good to them that is taking place at the exact same time. I mean, if we're talking about the inflation unemployment curve, and they will blame any aspect of inflation on him, but they won't credit him with any of the great employment figures we've got. But leave that to the side. Economics is not my specialty, although I am a bit of a student of political rhetoric. And I've taken economics, and I happen to be a huge fan of Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations. And so I want to go to the question of calling this legislation socialist. I thought that was rather interesting because as I read the legislation, it is just a bit of an improvisation in the middle of a crisis on existing laws dealing with unfair trade practices. And it would allow the president to declare that there's an emergency, which I think there is an emergency. It's an emergency for people how expensive gas is. I understand that there are people celebrating it. There are people in the oil and gas industry. The gentleman from Oklahoma is right. There are people who benefit from it and profit from it, and not just people at the top. There are people, in the oil and gas industry at other levels who are celebrating what's taking place. But most of the country's hurting. Most people are not celebrating. Most people are not cheering this. And, we read articles about how well the companies are doing. Billions of dollars more in this quarter than a year ago that they were making. Their profits are up 25%, 50% over where they were before. I understand why they are uncorking the champagne bottles in oil and gas, but this legislation would say it's an emergency in a lot of parts of the country for a lot of people. Let's take it seriously. Let's not just, blame our political opponents and then celebrate the fact that some people are getting rich off of this. So it says the president has the right to declare an emergency, and then when charges are unconsciously excessive or exploitative, then the general apparatus we have in place against unfair trade practices kicks in. Now, first of all, Mr. Pallone, do I basically have it right that This is already what the law is under the Federal Trade Commission Act, that you can't engage in unfair trade practices. And this just gives the president the power to declare an emergency to activate those provisions to determine whether there are companies that are engaged in unconsciously excessive price gouging.
Well, I would say it goes a little beyond what you're saying. I mean, you're basically right, but I think that the point I'm trying to make is that to just leave it to the FTC to decide whether there's price gouging right now might not be good enough. In other words, under this bill, because of the emergency, they would be able to go further and say, this is excessive, this is exploitative, and tries to explain what those aggravating situations might be. So I think it defines it a little better, and it makes it a lot easier for them to do it. Maybe is the best way to describe it.
All right. But as I understand the terms of legislation, what it says is if there are general prices that are prevailing, but you can demonstrate that certain companies have jacked up the price way beyond that in a way that's grossly excessive, that's a gross departure from the norm, then the general unfair trade practice provisions could kick in.
No, I agree. But I think that what we're trying to do is to define this a little better, to give them more power and penalties and also the language from Senator Cantwell about manipulation.
Okay.
That we mentioned.
So Ms. McMorris Rodgers, are you opposed to the general FTC provisions about unfair trade practices?
I don't think so.
Okay. So what would be wrong with saying if a particular company engages in unconsciously, unconscionably excessive gouging increases, that the FTC could then use those provisions in this situation?
To impose price controls?
No, it's not price
What you're
controls.
asking?
You mean like Richard Nixon's price controls, the last president who imposed them? No, there's no price controls as I read it in the legislation. All it does is it activates the FTC's power to act against unfair trade practices.
Part of this goes to the importance of us having a markup in committee, having a hearing in committee so that we could actually understand what these definitions are. The bill as written is very vague.
All right, what language is confusing to you about price controls? Because I couldn't find language of price controls in there anywhere.
The definition of unfair and deceptive practices is not defined.
Well, that comes from the FTC Act, which I thought you did support too. That's in current law about unfair trade practices. So all this is saying is that if there are unconscionably excessive prices being imposed on gas and oil.
Excessive is not defined.
Right, but excessive is a common term within this whole field of FTC policy. So you define it with respect to the market, if you will. So,
and it talks about the periods of time to activate, what that might be. Like you're looking at prices before and after in a particular locale.
Yeah.
That type of thing.
Given the last 2 years under a public health emergency, that we don't know when it's going to come to an end, I do not feel comfortable. I have grave concerns about giving power to the president to declare an emergency with such broad, vague terms. Who knows what is going to be put under this energy emergency?
Fair enough. So you say President Biden might want to go further and really lower gas and oil prices below what the companies ought to be able to charge. And so Biden is fighting too hard for the consumers to lower gas and oil prices, but none of it can be done without the FTC acting and then going to court and proving it. So the bottom line is, look, I don't think this is a be-all and end-all. I don't think this is going to save us from the situation we're in, but I think it can help us. And the language of socialism, I just don't see how it applies here. I mean, the American progressive tradition is all about making sure that people don't get ripped off. Nothing in this bill is about the government taking over the gas and oil fields or taking over the gas and oil companies. That's what I think socialism is, when you have state control of the means of production. And all this is saying is what 42 states have said, which is don't gouge the consumers. Don't take advantage of your position. And is that an anti-capitalist position? I don't think so. And for that, I will quote my beloved Adam Smith from The Wealth of Nations itself in 1776. And here's what he said: people of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. Adam Smith loved the idea of competition, but he said the people in competition are always going to be tempted to jack up the prices against the consumers. That's Adam Smith himself. Yeah. I mean, it's throughout The Wealth of Nations. And read, the theory of moral sentiments. So he didn't idolize and romanticize capitalism. He said it works when you have a real market in place and a government that enforces rules. Otherwise, people are going to get ripped off. And I think that's all the gentleman is saying, and I think that's all that HR 7688 is saying. The American people understand that the oil companies are producing gas and making gas. They also understand the oil companies have ripped people off in the past, and they can rip people off in a crisis, and this just gives the government the power to check that. So I like this bill.
Can I just,
yes.
I totally agree with you, and I don't want to prolong this, but, a lot of those on the Republican side in the last hour or so have been talking again and again about, the Keystone Pipeline and lack of permits and making it more difficult for oil companies to produce. And I just want to say, and I said it in the beginning, this is not the case. It is not the case. We have been advocating for increased production. The president is trying to increase production. And the bottom line is that I believe, and I think most of us believe, that there has to be a mix. We're not saying that, everything is going to be renewables now, because we know that you still have to have fossil fuels. And we had a hearing on hydropower. We've had hearings on nuclear. We've had hearings on all different types of energy. The bottom line is, in my opinion, the only legitimate argument that's being made on the other side, in my opinion, is what Mr. Cole said, and it's the same thing that the oil companies said at the hearing. They said, we are not making these investments because we're afraid the price is going to go down and we're going to lose our shirt. We're not making these investments for all these different reasons. But the bottom line is they are not increasing production. They are not doing it. And it may be because they're afraid that the price is going to go down. I think that if you pass this bill, you'll have a much clearer picture of what the real reason is why they're not increasing production and having more supply, which is they want to keep the price high. But that's what they said at the hearing. They didn't say that they didn't talk about Keystone. They didn't talk about lack of permits. They didn't talk about not having enough permits to do LNG. No one said that. They talked about the industry and the industry being afraid to increase production because of all these, historical reasons why maybe they would lose their shirt. And maybe that's a legitimate reason, but I don't believe that that's what's happening. I believe that they're keeping production low and supply limited so they can make more money and huge profits. And again, I don't want to take up your time, but we've heard a lot about it.
No, I appreciate that. It's a strategic business decision, and I think, as the gentleman from Pennsylvania said, businesses are out to make money. They're out to make profit, and that's what they do in our system. That's right. But then there comes a point where certain businesses are acting in a way totally against the public interest, as Adam Smith said, and that's why we have antitrust laws, which you could say interfere with the free market. And just by the way, because I think you guys are the committee that deals with this too, because there's been so much rhetoric about the free market today, and I love the idea of a free market, but a free market has got to be a fair market organized by law. Aren't you guys debating the question of whether or not the government in the Medicare program should have the power to negotiate in a free market with the prescription drug companies for lower prices, or whether that price should be set by the companies?
Again, it's the same thing. It's Adam Smith, right? When you say Adam Smith, I keep thinking of our Adam Smith. But
the original Adam Smith.
The original Adam Smith. Yeah, in other words, when the market forces are not working, that's when the government has to step in because it's become a monopoly. That's the whole progressive tradition of Teddy Roosevelt and Taft and
it sounds to me like socialism or corporate socialism to have big pharma dictating the prices for their own products, which is why our consumers are paying 5 or 10 times for the same pharmaceuticals that people are paying in Canada and in Europe, in other countries. You look for socialism, look there. But here, all we're talking about is preventing the worst exploitation of this crisis that was caused by events that are obvious to everybody coming out of COVID-19. I yield back to you, Madam Chair.